The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind Lady Eleanor as the guards dragged her down the stone steps into the castle's bowels. Her silk gown, once pristine white, now bore the stains of dirt and tears. The year was 1347, and she had just become another female prisoner in King Edward's dungeons. But what awaited her wasn't just confinement. It was something far worse, something that would make death seem like mercy. What I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you view medieval justice forever. For centuries, historians have sanitized the brutal reality of what happened to women who crossed medieval kings. They've given you sanitized versions in textbooks, romanticized portrayals in movies, but they've hidden the systematic cruelty that was not just accepted, but legally mandated. Today, we're diving into 7 punishments so horrific, so methodically designed to break the human spirit, that they were reserved specifically for female prisoners who dared defy royal authority. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated instruments of terror, each one crafted to send a message that would echo through every village, every noble house, every convent in the kingdom. You think you know about medieval punishment? You've probably heard about the rack, the Iron Maiden, maybe even the breaking wheel. But what you're about to discover goes beyond physical torture. These punishments attacked something deeper, something that medieval society considered more valuable than life itself. They destroyed honor, lineage, and social standing in ways that would haunt not just the victim, but generations of her family. Before we begin this journey into the darkest corners of medieval justice, I need you to understand something crucial. These weren't the actions of mad tyrants or sadistic individuals. They were legal procedures, documented in court records, witnessed by nobles, and sanctioned by the church. They were so normalized that scribes recorded them in the same matter-of-fact tone they used for tax collections and grain inventories. The 7 punishments we're about to explore escalate in their psychological sophistication. Each one builds upon the last, showing how medieval minds perfected the art of human destruction. From public humiliation that lasted lifetimes to physical mutilations that served as permanent warnings, these methods reveal a level of systematic cruelty that makes modern punishment seem almost humane by comparison. Here's what most people don't realize about medieval female prisoners. Their treatment wasn't just about punishment for crimes committed, it was about social control on a massive scale. Every woman who witnessed these punishments, every daughter who heard the stories, every wife who saw the consequences, learned exactly what happened to those who stepped outside the boundaries that kings and nobles had drawn. We'll start with punishments that seem almost merciful compared to what comes later. The Shame March, where noble ladies were stripped of everything that defined their social status and paraded through streets like common criminals. But this public humiliation was just the beginning, the appetizer to a feast of systematic degradation that would consume entire bloodlines. Then we'll explore the Convent imprisonment, which sounds almost peaceful until you understand the psychological warfare that happened behind monastery walls. Medieval kings discovered that breaking a woman's spirit was often more effective than breaking her body, and convents became prisons where the torment never ended because it was disguised as salvation. But the truly disturbing revelations come when we examine the bloodline erasure punishments, methods so thorough in their destruction that they didn't just eliminate the prisoner, but systematically removed her entire family line from existence. These weren't executions. They were genealogical annihilations that made it as if entire noble houses had never existed. The marriage punishments reveal perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated torture ever devised. Medieval kings understood that forcing a woman into specific types of unions could create suffering that lasted decades, turning what should have been protection into a lifetime of sanctioned abuse. As we progress through these 7 punishments, you'll notice how each one targets different aspects of medieval female identity. Their social status, their religious standing, their family connections, their physical integrity, and finally, their very existence in historical memory. It was a systematic destruction refined over centuries into an art form of human obliteration. The disfigurement punishments take us into territory that's difficult to discuss, where medieval justice used the female body as a canvas for displaying royal displeasure. These weren't random mutilations, but carefully planned modifications that served as permanent advertisements of what happened to women who defied royal authority. Finally, we'll confront the ultimate punishment, one so complete in its destruction that historians have actively avoided documenting it fully. The erasure protocol, where medieval kings didn't just execute female prisoners, but systematically removed every trace of their existence from historical records, family trees, and even graveyards. What makes these punishments particularly chilling is their bureaucratic efficiency. Medieval kingdoms developed entire administrative systems around female punishment. There were specialists who designed the torments, scribes who documented every detail, and officials whose sole job was ensuring that the psychological impact reached maximum effectiveness. The legal framework surrounding these punishments reveals something even more disturbing than the methods themselves. Medieval law didn't just permit these practices, it required them. Kings who showed mercy to female prisoners faced political consequences. Nobles who intervened risked becoming prisoners themselves. The Church's role in sanctioning these punishments adds another layer of horror to our story. Religious authorities didn't just tolerate these methods, they provided theological justification for each one. They created elaborate doctrines explaining why certain punishments were necessary for the salvation of both the prisoner and society. The social impact of these punishments extended far beyond their immediate victims. Every noble family lived in constant fear that their daughters, wives, or sisters might somehow attract royal displeasure. This fear shaped behavior, limited women's actions, and created a culture of surveillance, where families policed themselves to avoid royal attention. The documentation of these punishments provides our most reliable historical evidence, but it also reveals the casual attitude medieval society had towards systematic cruelty. Court records describe horrific torments in the same tone used for recording weather conditions or crop yields. The evolution of these punishments over time shows how medieval justice became increasingly sophisticated in its cruelty. Early medieval punishments were straightforward executions or exile. By the late medieval period, kings had developed complex psychological torments that could extend suffering across multiple generations. The geographic spread of these practices reveals their systematic nature. From England to France, from the Holy Roman Empire to the Italian city-states, similar punishments appeared wherever centralized royal power needed to control female behavior. This wasn't random cruelty, but coordinated policy implemented across medieval Europe. The technology developed specifically for female punishment shows the resources medieval kingdoms devoted to systematic cruelty. Specialized devices, custom-built chambers, and trained personnel created an infrastructure of suffering that operated like any other government department. The survival rate among female prisoners subjected to these punishments was deliberately kept low, but not at zero. Medieval kings understood that some survivors were necessary to spread fear and testify to the effectiveness of royal justice. The calculated nature of who lived and who died reveals the mathematical precision behind the cruelty. The psychological studies of surviving accounts reveal the long-term impact these punishments had on entire societies. Generations of women modified their behavior based on stories of what happened to those who crossed royal authority. The punishments succeeded in their primary goal of social control through terror. As we prepare to examine each of these 7 punishments in detail, remember that we're not just exploring historical curiosities. We're uncovering the systematic methods that medieval power structures used to maintain control through the targeted destruction of those who challenged their authority. The transformation of women from honored members of noble society to broken prisoners didn't happen overnight. It was a carefully orchestrated process that medieval kingdoms perfected over centuries of practice. Each step was designed to maximize psychological impact while maintaining the appearance of legal justice. The witnesses to these punishments weren't just passive observers. They were active participants in a system that required community involvement to achieve maximum effectiveness. Everyone from nobles to peasants played assigned roles in these elaborate displays of royal power. The aftermath of these punishments created ripple effects that lasted for generations. Families associated with punished women faced social exile, economic ruin, and political isolation. The punishments succeeded in destroying not just individuals, but entire social networks. Now, let's begin our examination of the first punishment, one that seems almost gentle compared to what follows, but served as the foundation for all the horrors that came after. The first punishment that medieval kings unleashed upon female prisoners was deceptively simple in its execution, yet devastating in its psychological impact. The Shame March wasn't just about public humiliation, it was about systematically dismantling everything that defined a woman's place in medieval society, piece by carefully calculated piece. Picture Lady Margaret of Pembroke, accused of plotting against King John in 1203. At dawn, she was dragged from her cell in the Tower of London. But here's where it gets truly diabolical. The guards didn't just strip her of her fine clothes, they methodically removed every symbol of her noble status while explaining to gathered witnesses what each item represented and why she was no longer worthy to wear it. First came the golden circlet that marked her rank as a countess. As it was pulled from her head, a herald announced that she had forfeited all claim to noble blood through her treachery. Then her silk gown, each layer representing generations of family honor, was cut away with ceremonial daggers while scribes recorded every detail for posterity. But the true genius of the Shame March lay in its timing and route. Medieval kings understood that maximum humiliation required maximum witnesses. The procession would begin at the castle gates at the busiest time of day, when merchants were setting up their stalls and craftsmen were beginning their work. The route was carefully planned to pass every significant location where the woman had once held respect. Lady Margaret was forced to walk barefoot through the mud, wearing only a rough sackcloth shift that marked her as lower than the poorest peasant. A town crier preceded her, announcing her crimes to ensure no one missed the spectacle. Behind her walked a priest, not to offer comfort, but to explain to the crowd why God had withdrawn his protection from such a sinful woman. The psychological warfare didn't stop with the prisoner herself. Her female relatives were forced to watch from designated positions along the route. Her daughters saw their mother reduced to an object of public mockery. Her sisters witnessed the complete destruction of family honor. The message was unmistakable. This could happen to any woman who forgot her place. The crowds weren't passive observers. They were encouraged, sometimes required, to participate. Rotten vegetables and human waste were distributed by royal officials for throwing. Children were lifted onto shoulders to get better views and remember the lesson. The entire community became complicit in the destruction of a woman who had once commanded their respect. What made the Shame March particularly cruel was its duration. Unlike a quick execution, this punishment could last for hours as the procession wound through every street, every marketplace, every church courtyard. The woman's feet would bleed from walking on rough cobblestones. Her voice would give out from the involuntary cries that the pain and humiliation extracted. Medieval chroniclers recorded these events with disturbing attention to detail. They noted how Lady Margaret's composure cracked after the first hour when a baker's wife, someone who had once bowed to her, spat directly in her face. They documented how her shoulders began to shake when she was forced to kneel before the cathedral where she had been married 20 years earlier. The route always included specific stops designed for maximum psychological impact. The woman would be forced to kneel at the doors of every church, while priests explained to gathered crowds how her sins had corrupted the sacred spaces where she once worshipped. She would be made to stand before her own family's coat of arms, carved in stone above various buildings, while heralds explained how she had dishonored every ancestor who had borne that symbol. The most devastating stop was always saved for last. The woman would be brought to the marketplace pillory, where she would be secured for additional hours while the crowd continued their abuse. But here's what most people don't realize about medieval pillories. They weren't just restraining devices. They were designed to force the prisoner into positions that made them helpless against any form of assault the crowd chose to inflict. The Shame March served multiple purposes beyond punishing the individual prisoner. It was a masterclass in social control that reinforced every hierarchy medieval society depended upon. Women watching learned exactly what happened when they stepped outside prescribed boundaries. Men learned that their protection of women was conditional upon those women's obedience to royal authority. The economic impact was equally calculated. A noble woman subjected to the Shame March lost more than her dignity. She lost her legal right to own property, to make contracts, to inherit wealth. Her children were stripped of their inheritance rights, Her husband could divorce her without penalty and keep all her dowry. The punishment destroyed entire family fortunes with bureaucratic efficiency. The religious dimension added another layer of torment. After the shame march, the woman was considered spiritually contaminated. She couldn't receive communion, couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, couldn't have her children baptized in the family church. The church worked hand in hand with royal authority to ensure that the punishment extended into the afterlife itself. Medieval records show that survival rates for the shame march were actually quite high, but that was intentional. Dead martyrs could inspire sympathy and resistance. Broken women who lived to serve as examples were far more effective tools of social control. The survivors were living reminders of royal power, walking advertisements for the consequences of defiance. The second punishment takes us behind monastery walls, where medieval kings discovered that psychological torture could be more effective than physical brutality. The convent imprisonment sounds almost merciful compared to the shame march, until you understand what really happened to women who were delivered to certain religious houses for their supposed salvation. Sister Agnes had been the abbess of Whitmore Convent for 30 years when King Edward II sent her Lady Catherine de Clare in 1322. The official document stated that Lady Catherine would spend her remaining years in prayer and contemplation, seeking God's forgiveness for her political crimes. The reality was a carefully orchestrated program of psychological destruction that would make her beg for the executioner's axe. Medieval convents that served as royal prisons operated under special rules that suspended normal religious protections. The women sent there weren't just prisoners, they were subjects of systematic experimentation in breaking human will. The methods developed in these religious prisons would later influence interrogation techniques used by the Inquisition. Lady Catherine arrived at Whitmore expecting harsh but predictable convent life. Prayer, manual labor, simple food, and isolation from the outside world. What she found was something far more sophisticated in its cruelty. The nuns had developed techniques for psychological torture that left no physical marks but could reduce a noblewoman to a broken shell within months. The first technique was temporal disorientation. Lady Catherine was placed in a windowless cell where she couldn't distinguish day from night. Meals were served at irregular intervals, sometimes 3 times in what felt like a few hours, sometimes not for what seemed like days. Prayer bells rang at random times, destroying any sense of routine or stability. Sleep deprivation was implemented through what the nuns called spiritual vigilance. Lady Catherine was awakened multiple times each night for mandatory prayers that lasted hours. When she tried to sleep during the day, she was dragged to manual labor in the convent gardens. Her body clock was systematically destroyed, leaving her in a constant state of exhaustion and confusion. The food manipulation went beyond simple starvation. Lady Catherine was fed meals that were deliberately oversalted one day, completely bland the next. Sometimes her food contained herbs that caused nausea or diarrhea. Other days she received rich foods that made her sick after months of simple fare. Her body never knew what to expect, creating constant physical distress. Sensory manipulation was perhaps the cruelest technique. Lady Catherine spent weeks in complete silence, forbidden to speak or hear human voices except during interrogation sessions. Then she would be subjected to hours of overlapping prayers, chants, and bells that created overwhelming noise. Her senses were kept in constant imbalance, never allowed to adjust to any consistent environment. The religious aspect provided perfect cover for the psychological torture. Every technique was justified as spiritual discipline designed to break the prisoner's sinful pride and bring her closer to God. When Lady Catherine showed signs of mental breakdown, the nuns claimed it was evidence that God was working to purge her soul of evil. The isolation wasn't just physical. Lady Catherine was cut off from all news of the outside world, including her own family. She didn't know if her children were alive or dead, if her husband had remarried, if her estates had been confiscated. This information blackout was carefully maintained to maximize her psychological vulnerability. False information was sometimes provided to increase her suffering. Nuns would casually mention that her eldest son had died in battle, then weeks later contradict themselves with different news. Lady Catherine never knew what was true, keeping her in a constant state of grief and uncertainty about everything she had once held dear. The interrogation sessions were disguised as confession, but they were actually sophisticated psychological warfare. Priests trained in breaking resistance would spend hours questioning Lady Catherine about her political activities, her family connections, her private thoughts. They used information gathered during these sessions to manipulate her further. The sexual dimension of the punishment was never explicitly acknowledged but was always present. Lady Catherine was subjected to intimate searches by male guards under the pretense of preventing suicide attempts. Her correspondence was monitored for any sign of romantic attachment to anyone, living or dead. Her sexuality was treated as evidence of her spiritual corruption. The documentation of Lady Catherine's psychological deterioration was meticulous. Convent records tracked her weight loss, her sleep patterns, her emotional responses, her religious compliance. This wasn't just imprisonment. It was a clinical study in human destruction conducted under the guise of religious salvation. The most insidious aspect of convent imprisonment was how it corrupted the prisoner's relationship with faith itself. Lady Catherine had been a devout woman before her imprisonment. The nuns systematically used her religious beliefs against her, convincing her that her suffering was divine punishment for her sins, that her mental breakdown was proof of her spiritual corruption. After 18 months at Whitmore, Lady Catherine was released as an example of successful religious rehabilitation. But the woman who emerged bore no resemblance to the proud noble who had entered. She was broken, confused, and completely submissive to royal authority. More importantly, she served as a living warning to other noble women about what awaited them if they opposed the king. The third punishment reveals how medieval kings understood that destroying bloodlines could be more effective than destroying individuals. The bloodline erasure wasn't just about eliminating a female prisoner, it was about systematically removing her entire family from existence, both present and future. When Lady Isabel de Fort was accused of conspiracy against King Edward I in 1293, her punishment extended far beyond her own fate. The king ordered what court documents euphemistically called the cleansing of corrupted blood, a process that would eliminate not just Lady Isabel, but every trace of her family's existence. The process began with what medieval lawyers called genealogical investigation, but what was actually a systematic hunt for every person who shared Lady Isabel's blood. Royal clerks spent months tracing her family tree, identifying cousins, nieces, nephews, and distant relatives who had never even met her. Marriage records were examined, baptismal documents scrutinized, and witnesses interrogated to create a complete map of her bloodline. The king's men didn't just target the obvious relatives. They hunted down servants who had worked for Isabel's family for decades, merchants who had done business with her estates, even priests who had performed marriages or baptisms for her relatives. Anyone connected to her bloodline became a potential target for elimination. The execution of bloodline erasure followed a specific sequence designed for maximum psychological impact. Lady Isabel was forced to watch as her family members were brought before her, one by one, to face their individual fates. Her youngest brother was first, accused of sharing her treasonous thoughts simply by virtue of their shared parentage. Medieval chroniclers recorded how Lady Isabel's composure finally shattered when they brought in her 8-year-old nephew, a boy who didn't even know why he was there. The child was declared guilty of carrying corrupted blood that would inevitably lead him to treason against the crown. His execution was scheduled for the same day as his aunt's, ensuring that she would watch him die knowing she was responsible. But physical elimination was only part of the process. The real genius of bloodline erasure lay in its systematic destruction of historical memory. Royal scribes worked simultaneously to remove every mention of Lady Isabel's family from official records. Property deeds were altered, tax rolls were rewritten, and marriage contracts were destroyed or modified to eliminate any trace of her bloodline. The heraldic destruction was particularly thorough. Lady Isabel's family coat of arms was officially declared null and void. Every carving, painting, or tapestry displaying their symbols was ordered destroyed. Stonemasons worked for weeks chiseling away heraldic devices from buildings, while artists painted over family portraits that had hung in noble houses for generations. Churches became battlegrounds in the war against family memory. Tomb inscriptions mentioning Lady Isabel's relatives were ground away with chisels. Stained glass windows depicting family members were carefully removed, and replaced with generic religious imagery. Even marriage records and church registries were altered to eliminate any reference to her bloodline. The economic erasure was equally systematic. All properties, investments, and business interests connected to Lady Isabel's family were confiscated and redistributed to royal supporters. But the records of these transactions were then altered to make it appear as if the properties had always belonged to their new owners. The family's wealth didn't just change hands, it was made to appear as if it had never existed in the first place. The marriage annulments were perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire process. Lady Isabel was forced to watch as her daughter's marriage was declared invalid due to corrupted bloodline. The young woman, who had been happily married for 3 years, was suddenly a bastard whose children would have no legal standing. Her husband was given permission to remarry immediately as if his first wife had never existed. Medieval law provided the perfect framework for this systematic obliteration. The concept of corruption of blood meant that treason didn't just affect the individual traitor, but contaminated their entire bloodline retroactively. Children, grandchildren, and even ancestors could be declared guilty of crimes they had never committed and punishments they had never earned. The documentation process was meticulous in its thoroughness. Royal clerks created detailed inventories of every person, property, and possession connected to Lady Isabel's bloodline before systematically destroying or redistributing everything on those lists. The paperwork for bloodline erasure often exceeded the documentation for major military campaigns. Witness intimidation ensured that no one would speak of the erased family in the future. Servants who had worked for Lady Isabel's relatives were given new identities and relocated to distant parts of the kingdom. Anyone who had known the family personally was required to swear oaths, never to mention their names or discuss their existence. The psychological impact on surviving nobles was exactly what the king intended. Every family with daughters, sisters, or wives understood that their entire bloodline could be eliminated if any female member attracted royal displeasure. The fear created by bloodline erasure was so effective that many noble families began voluntarily surrendering troublesome female relatives to prevent collective punishment. The religious justification for this systematic erasure came from theological concepts about inherited sin and corrupted souls. Church authorities argue that some bloodlines became so tainted by treason that they posed a spiritual threat to the entire kingdom. Eliminating these families wasn't just political necessity, it was divine obligation. The efficiency of medieval record-keeping made bloodline erasure remarkably effective. Within a year of Lady Isabel's execution, historians searching royal archives would find no mention of her family name in any official document. Their estates appeared to have always belonged to other families. Their marriages seemed never to have occurred. Their children were listed as bastards of unknown parentage. The fourth punishment takes us into territory where medieval justice became matrimonial warfare. The marriage punishment wasn't about forcing women into unwanted unions. It was about weaponizing marriage itself to create decades of sanctioned suffering that would serve as a permanent warning to other potential rebels. Lady Gwyneth of Wales discovered the true meaning of marriage punishment in 1295, when King Edward I decided her execution would be too merciful for her role in supporting Welsh independence. Instead, she would be married to Sir Ranulph the Leper, a knight whose disease had progressed so far that even hardened soldiers refused to serve under him. The genius of marriage punishment lay in its legal permanence. Unlike other torments that ended with death, marriage created suffering that could last for decades while appearing completely legitimate to outside observers. The woman became trapped in a relationship designed specifically for her torment, with no legal recourse for escape. Medieval marriage law provided the perfect framework for this systematic abuse. Once married, a woman's legal identity disappeared entirely. She became her husband's property in every sense, unable to own assets, make contracts, or even leave the house without his permission. If that husband was chosen specifically for his cruelty, the woman faced decades of legalized torture. Sir Ranulph wasn't selected randomly for Lady Gwyneth's punishment. Royal investigators had spent months identifying the perfect candidate, a man whose combination of physical disease, mental instability, and sadistic tendencies would create maximum suffering for their victim. His leprosy was advanced enough to make physical contact revolting, but not so severe that he would die quickly and end her torment. The wedding ceremony itself was designed as public humiliation. Lady Gwyneth was forced to speak her vows while standing next to a man whose rotting flesh filled the church with the stench of decay. Noble witnesses were required to attend and celebrate the union, creating a grotesque parody of matrimonial joy that reinforced the king's power to corrupt even the most sacred institutions. The marital arrangements guaranteed that Lady Gwyneth's suffering would be witnessed and documented. Sir Ranulph was provided with a detailed household staff, whose real job was to observe and report on the daily torments he inflicted upon his wife. Their reports were compiled into regular summaries that were sent to court for the king's personal review. The sexual dimension of marriage punishment was perhaps its most horrific aspect. Lady Gwyneth was legally required to submit to her diseased husband's demands, while knowing that any children resulting from their union would likely be born with his afflictions. The prospect of bringing diseased children into the world added another layer of psychological torture to her daily existence. The isolation was carefully orchestrated. Sir Ranulph's estates were located in remote areas where Lady Gwyneth had no allies or potential rescuers. Her correspondence was monitored and restricted. Visitors were discouraged through rumors about the contagious nature of her husband's condition. She was cut off from any source of comfort or support. The economic control was absolute. Lady Gwyneth's substantial dowry became Sir Ranulph's property, but he was instructed to spend it in ways that would maximize her psychological distress. Her family's heirlooms were sold to pay his gambling debts. Her beloved horses were butchered for meat. Everything she had once treasured was systematically destroyed or defiled. The medical torture was disguised as marital duty. Sir Ranulph would force Lady Gwyneth to tend to his diseased body, cleaning his wounds and applying treatments that exposed her to potential infection. She was required to share his bed, his meals, and his personal items, creating constant fear of contracting his leprosy. The religious persecution was equally systematic. Lady Gwyneth had been a devout Catholic, but Sir Ranulph was instructed to force her participation in heretical practices that would damn her soul. She was made to blaspheme during their private prayers, to desecrate religious artifacts, and to perform acts that violated every tenet of her faith. The psychological manipulation was perhaps the most sophisticated torture ever devised. Sir Ranulph would alternate between periods of extreme cruelty and unexpected kindness, keeping Lady Gwyneth in a constant state of confusion about what to expect. Just when she adjusted to one form of abuse, he would change tactics entirely. The documentation of Lady Gwyneth's deterioration was meticulous. Household reports tracked her weight loss, her emotional breakdowns, her attempts at resistance, and her gradual submission to her husband's demands. This information was used to refine marriage punishment techniques for future victims. The public perception was carefully managed. To outside observers, Lady Gwyneth appeared to be a dutiful wife, caring for her afflicted husband. Any signs of distress were attributed to the natural stress of nursing a leper. Her punishment was hidden in plain sight, disguised as marital devotion. The inheritance manipulation added another dimension to her torment. Sir Ranulph was instructed to father children with Lady Gwyneth, but any offspring would be raised to hate their mother and worship their father. She would be forced to bear and nurture children who would eventually become instruments of her own continued punishment. After 7 years of marriage punishment, Lady Gwyneth died under mysterious circumstances that were officially attributed to her husband's disease. But court records suggest she was poisoned when her suffering was no longer serving its intended purpose of terrorizing other potential rebels. The fifth punishment ventures into territory where medieval justice became surgical precision in human destruction. The disfigurement punishments weren't random mutilations born of anger or sadism. They were carefully calculated modifications to the female body that served as permanent advertisements of royal displeasure, while ensuring the victim's survival to spread fear throughout the kingdom. When Lady Matilda de Braose was captured, after her failed rebellion against King John in 1208, her execution would have been too simple, too quick, too merciful for the message the king wanted to send. Instead, She would become a living monument to the consequences of female defiance. Her body transformed into a canvas displaying royal justice for all to see. The selection of specific disfigurements followed elaborate protocols developed by royal physicians who had studied the psychological impact of various mutilations. The goal wasn't just to punish Lady Matilda, but to create a walking advertisement that would terrify other noble women into absolute submission. Every cut, every removal, every modification was designed for maximum visual impact and social meaning. The facial disfigurements were always performed first, while the victim was still strong enough to survive the trauma. Lady Matilda's nose was removed using techniques borrowed from Islamic medical texts, ensuring that the wound would heal cleanly but leave her permanently marked as a criminal. The specific method of removal indicated the nature of her crime to anyone familiar with the royal justice system. Medieval audiences understood the symbolic language of disfigurement with the same clarity that modern people read traffic signs. A missing nose indicated treason. Severed ears meant disobedience to royal commands. Branded foreheads displayed the specific crime committed. Lady Matilda's face became a billboard, advertising her sins to anyone who encountered her. The hand mutilations served both symbolic and practical purposes. Lady Matilda's right index finger was severed to prevent her from ever again signing documents or sealing letters that might threaten royal authority. The specific finger chosen indicated that her crime involved written correspondence, while the public nature of the amputation demonstrated royal power over noble communication networks. The surgical precision of these procedures reveals the sophisticated medical knowledge available to medieval torturers. Royal physicians had developed techniques that maximized disfigurement while minimizing the risk of death from infection or blood loss. They used cauterization methods borrowed from battlefield medicine to ensure their victims survived to serve as living warnings. The timing of each mutilation was carefully calculated to maintain the victim's consciousness throughout the entire process. Lady Matilda was kept awake using stimulants derived from exotic herbs while experiencing each modification to her body. Her screams were considered an essential part of the punishment, both for their psychological impact on her and their effect on witnessing crowds. The public nature of disfigurement punishments was crucial to their effectiveness. Lady Matilda's mutilations were performed in the courtyard of her own castle in front of servants, tenants, and local nobles who had once shown her respect. The message was unmistakable. Royal authority could reach into any stronghold and destroy anyone who challenged it. The medical aftercare was designed to ensure survival while maximizing long-term suffering. Lady Matilda's wounds were treated just enough to prevent fatal infection, but she was denied any medication for pain relief. She was forced to live with constant physical discomfort that would remind her hourly of her punishment while serving as a visible deterrent to others. The social impact of disfigurement extended far beyond the physical modifications themselves. Lady Matilda became unemployable as a governess or companion, unmarriageable due to her appearance, and unable to participate in court functions where her presence would remind everyone of royal power. Her disfigurement was social death while keeping her biologically alive. The documentation of these procedures was extensive and clinically detailed. Royal physicians recorded the exact methods used, the victim's responses, the healing process, and the long-term effectiveness of each type of mutilation. This information was compiled into manuals that were distributed to other kingdoms as examples of sophisticated justice techniques. The religious justification for disfigurement came from biblical precedents about marking sinners and criminals. Church authorities argued that visible punishment served divine justice by allowing the community to identify and avoid corrupted individuals. The disfigurements were presented as divine will made manifest through royal authority. The psychological impact on the victim was carefully studied and documented. Lady Matilda's mental deterioration was tracked through regular reports from observers who monitored her behavior, her speech patterns, and her emotional responses. The goal was to understand how physical disfigurement affected mental stability and social compliance. The economic consequences of disfigurement were equally devastating. Lady Matilda lost all her property rights, her inheritance claims, and her ability to generate income through marriage or employment. She became completely dependent on royal charity for survival, ensuring that her continued existence served the king's political purposes. The medical complications that developed over time were seen as additional punishments rather than unfortunate side effects. When Lady Matilda's facial wounds became infected years later, causing additional pain and further disfigurement, court physicians recorded these developments as evidence of divine justice continuing to work through her body. The final punishment in our catalog of medieval cruelty represents the ultimate expression of royal power over female prisoners. The erasure protocol wasn't just about execution. It was about removing every trace of a woman's existence from history itself, creating a form of death so complete that it was as if she had never been born. When Lady Elizabeth de Montfort was accused of orchestrating a plot against King Edward III in 1351, her crime transcended ordinary treason. She had committed the ultimate sin in medieval eyes. She had used her intelligence, her connections, and her noble status to threaten the very foundation of royal authority. For such audacity, mere execution would be insufficient. She would face the erasure protocol, a punishment so thorough that it would make her disappear from existence itself. The erasure protocol began before Lady Elizabeth even knew she was condemned. Royal agents had been working for months to systematically remove every trace of her life from official records, church registries, and family documents. Her name was carefully scraped from parchments using specialized tools that left no evidence of alteration. Tax rolls were rewritten, marriage contracts were destroyed, and property deeds were modified to show that her estates had always belonged to other families. The sophistication of medieval record-keeping made this systematic obliteration remarkably effective. Royal scribes had developed techniques for altering documents that were virtually undetectable to contemporary observers. They used inks that matched aged parchments perfectly, employed handwriting experts who could replicate the styles of long-dead clerks, and created false dating systems that made their alterations appear authentic. Church records received special attention during the erasure protocol. Lady Elizabeth's baptismal documents were removed from parish registries and burned in ceremonial fires, blessed by bishops who declared that her soul had been retroactively rejected by God. Her confirmation records were scraped away with blessed knives, symbolically removing her from the community of Christian believers. The genealogical destruction was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the entire process. Lady Elizabeth's name was systematically removed from every family tree, every heraldic record, and every noble lineage document in the kingdom. Royal heralds worked for months tracking down every manuscript that mentioned her existence, either destroying them entirely or carefully altering them to eliminate any reference to her life. Marriage records posed a particular challenge for the erasure protocol. Lady Elizabeth had been married for 15 years and had borne 3 children. Simply destroying the marriage documents would create obvious gaps in church records that might raise questions. Instead, royal agents created elaborate false histories showing that her husband had married a different woman entirely, someone who conveniently died in childbirth after producing the same number of offspring. The children presented the most complex aspect of the erasure protocol. They couldn't be eliminated without raising suspicions, but their mother's existence had to be completely obliterated. Royal genealogists created intricate false documentation showing that the children were the product of their father's relationship with a fictional woman whose own death explained why no one remembered her. Property records required equally sophisticated manipulation. Lady Elizabeth had owned substantial estates, controlled valuable trade routes, and held significant investments in merchant ventures. All of these assets had to be redistributed without creating obvious evidence that they had once belonged to someone else. Royal clerks developed complex paper trails showing that these properties had been gradually acquired by their new owners through legitimate purchases and inheritances. The physical evidence of Lady Elizabeth's existence was systematically destroyed with scientific precision. Every portrait was removed from castle walls and burned in special furnaces, designed to leave no recoverable ash. Personal items were melted down, broken apart, or buried in unmarked locations that only royal agents knew. Even her clothing was unraveled and the threads burned separately to ensure complete destruction. Architectural evidence posed unique challenges that revealed the thoroughness of medieval erasure protocols. Lady Elizabeth's family coat of arms had been carved into stone facades, painted on ceiling beams, and woven into tapestries throughout her estates. Teams of skilled craftsmen worked for months carefully removing these heraldic symbols and replacing them with generic decorative patterns that matched the surrounding artwork perfectly. The witness elimination process was handled with brutal efficiency. Servants who had worked in Lady Elizabeth's household for decades were given new identities and relocated to distant parts of the kingdom. Those who refused to cooperate with the fiction of her non-existence were quietly eliminated through accidents, illnesses, or disappearances that attracted no official attention. Church authorities played crucial roles in legitimizing the erasure protocol through theological justification. Bishops declared that Lady Elizabeth had been so corrupted by evil that God had retroactively rejected her existence, removing her from the divine plan as if she had never been born. This religious framework made questioning her disappearance equivalent to challenging God's will. The timeline for completing an erasure protocol typically required 2 to 3 years of intensive work by teams of specialized agents. Royal records show detailed project management approaches with specific deadlines for different aspects of the obliteration process. The destruction of written records had to be completed before physical evidence was eliminated to prevent witnesses from connecting the disappearing documents to the missing person. Quality control measures ensured that no trace of the erased person would survive to contradict the official fiction. Royal inspectors would conduct thorough reviews months after the initial obliteration, searching for any overlooked references, forgotten documents, or surviving witnesses who might compromise the illusion of non-existence. The psychological impact on surviving family members was carefully managed through a combination of threats and incentives. Lady Elizabeth's husband was remarried to a carefully selected woman within months of his wife's disappearance, creating new emotional attachments that made him less likely to dwell on his previous relationship. Her children were gradually convinced that their memories of their mother were confused recollections of other women in their lives. The economic incentives for cooperation with erasure protocols were substantial. Family members who fully embraced the fiction of their relatives' non-existence often found themselves rewarded with additional lands, favorable marriages, or prestigious appointments. Those who showed reluctance to forget faced gradual isolation, economic pressure, and eventual elimination if they persisted in remembering. The international coordination required for effective erasure protocols reveals the sophisticated diplomatic networks available to medieval kingdoms. When Lady Elizabeth had connections to foreign courts, royal agents worked with their counterparts in other kingdoms to ensure that references to her were eliminated from international correspondence, trade agreements, and diplomatic records. The success of the erasure protocol was measured not just by the absence of records, but by the complete lack of curiosity about the missing person. Within 5 years of Lady Elizabeth's disappearance, no one in the kingdom remembered her existence. Her husband spoke fondly of his current wife as his first and only love. Her children showed no signs of missing a mother they had been convinced never existed. The documentation of erasure protocols was itself subject to eventual destruction. After successful completion of the obliteration process, even the records of the obliteration were systematically eliminated. The only evidence that survived was buried in the most secret royal archives, accessible only to future kings who might need to implement similar punishments. The legal framework for erasure protocols was never written down in any permanent form. The procedures were transmitted orally through carefully selected royal agents who swore binding oaths never to reveal the methods or acknowledge their existence. This oral tradition ensured that the techniques could be preserved while leaving no documentary evidence of their use. The ultimate test of a successful erasure protocol came decades later when historians attempting to research the period would find inexplicable gaps in records, mysterious inconsistencies in family genealogies, and persistent rumors about people who had supposedly never existed. The perfect erasure protocol left just enough contradictory evidence to drive researchers mad, while providing no concrete proof of the obliterated person's existence. Lady Elizabeth de Montfort vanished so completely that modern historians debate whether she ever existed at all. Some scholars argue that she was a fictional character created by medieval chroniclers to illustrate the dangers of female political ambition. Others point to subtle inconsistencies in contemporary records that suggest systematic document alteration. The truth remains buried with the agents who implemented her erasure protocol, taking their secrets to unmarked graves. The legacy of these 7 punishments extends far beyond their immediate victims, into the very foundation of how medieval society controlled and shaped female behavior. Each method, from the public degradation of the Shawm March to the complete obliteration of the erasure protocol, represented a different tool in an arsenal of systematic oppression that kept half the population in a state of constant terror. But here's what makes this historical nightmare truly chilling. These weren't the products of individual madness or random cruelty. They were the result of centuries of refinement, institutional learning, and bureaucratic efficiency applied to the systematic destruction of human beings. Medieval kingdoms had created entire government departments dedicated to perfecting these methods, complete with specialized personnel, standardized procedures, and performance metrics. The documentation that survives reveals the casual, business-like attitude that medieval authorities had toward implementing these punishments. Court records describe the most horrific torments in the same matter-of-fact tone used for recording grain harvest or tax collections. The systematic nature of the cruelty was so normalized that it required no special justification or emotional preparation. The ripple effects of these punishments extended far beyond their immediate victims to shape the behavior of entire generations of women. Every noble daughter grew up knowing exactly what awaited those who challenged royal authority. Every wife understood the consequences of political involvement. Every mother taught her daughters the paramount importance of submission and invisibility. The efficiency of these systems created a self-perpetuating cycle of oppression, where the mere threat of punishment was often sufficient to maintain control. The occasional implementation of these methods served as reminders to keep the fear fresh and immediate. Medieval kings discovered that systematic cruelty, properly applied, could eliminate the need for constant violence by creating cultures of preemptive submission. The intersection of religious authority and royal power made these punishments particularly devastating because they attacked both earthly and spiritual dimensions of female existence. Women couldn't escape into faith because the church sanctioned their destruction. They couldn't find refuge in family because bloodline punishments threatened everyone they loved. They couldn't rely on legal protections because the law itself was weaponized against them. The technological innovation that went into perfecting these punishments reveals a level of systematic cruelty that defies modern comprehension. Medieval kingdoms invested the same resources into developing torture techniques that they devoted to military engineering or agricultural advancement. Specialized craftsmen designed custom devices, physicians studied optimal pain thresholds, and administrators tracked effectiveness metrics with the precision of modern corporate management. The psychological sophistication of these methods shows that medieval minds understood human nature with terrifying clarity. They knew that physical pain could be endured, but that attacking identity, memory, and social connections could break people more completely than any rack or wheel. The punishments weren't just about inflicting suffering, they were about systematically dismantling everything that made their victims human. The survival of detailed records describing these methods provides us with an uncomfortable window into how organized evil actually functions. It doesn't emerge from chaos or madness. It develops through careful planning, institutional support, and gradual normalization of increasingly extreme measures. The bureaucrats who implemented these punishments went home to their families each evening as if they had spent the day managing routine administrative tasks. The international spread of these techniques reveals how efficiently medieval kingdoms shared innovations in systematic cruelty. Methods developed in England appeared in French courts within years. Techniques perfected in the Holy Roman Empire found their way to Italian city-states through diplomatic channels. The systematic oppression of women became a shared technology that crossed borders as readily as military tactics or architectural styles. The economic calculations behind these punishments show how thoroughly medieval societies had commodified human suffering. Kings weighed the costs of implementation against the benefits of social control. They measured return on investment in terms of reduced rebellion rates and increased noble compliance. Human destruction became a budget line item that competed with castle construction and military campaigns for royal resources. The religious framework that justified these punishments created a perfect storm of spiritual and temporal authority working together to destroy individual women while terrorizing entire populations. When both God and king demanded the same systematic cruelty, resistance became not just politically dangerous, but spiritually damning. The victims were isolated not just from human help, but from divine mercy itself. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these seven punishments is how completely they succeeded in their ultimate goal. For centuries, women internalized the lessons of systematic terror so thoroughly that they policed themselves more effectively than any external authority could have managed. The threat of punishment became unnecessary because the fear of punishment had been bred into the very foundations of female consciousness. The historical amnesia surrounding these practices reveals how successfully medieval kingdoms buried their own systematic cruelty. Modern audiences learn about heroic knights and romantic courtly love, while remaining ignorant of the calculated brutality that maintained the social order those fairy tales celebrated. The sanitized version of medieval history serves the same function today that the punishment served then, keeping uncomfortable truths buried where they can't challenge existing power structures. Understanding these seven punishments changes everything about how we view not just medieval history, but the entire development of Western civilization. The systematic oppression of women wasn't an unfortunate side effect of less enlightened times. It was a carefully engineered foundation that supported centuries of male political dominance. The methods may have evolved, but the underlying patterns of institutional control remain disturbingly familiar. The women who suffered these punishments deserve to be remembered not as cautionary tales about the dangers of female ambition, but as human beings who paid an unimaginable price for challenging systems designed to keep them powerless. Their stories reveal both the worst capabilities of organized human cruelty and the extraordinary courage it took to resist authority when the consequences were so completely devastating. Today, we live in a world where privacy laws protect medical information, where legal systems provide due process protections, where religious institutions can't legally sanction systematic torture. These aren't ancient rights that humans have always possessed. They're modern inventions that took centuries to develop and can be lost more quickly than most people realize. The systematic cruelty of medieval female punishment serves as a permanent reminder that civilization is always more fragile than it appears, that institutional evil can flourish under the guise of legal authority, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would use systematic terror to maintain their power over others. The seven punishments we've explored today represent just a fraction of the documented methods medieval kingdoms used to control female behavior. But they reveal the essential truth about how systematic oppression actually functions. It succeeds not through random violence, but through calculated cruelty that attacks the very foundations of human identity and social connection. Remember Lady Eleanor from our opening? Dragged down those stone steps into King Edward's dungeons? Now you understand that her fate was never in doubt from the moment those heavy doors slammed shut behind her. The only question was which of these seven punishments would serve the king's political purposes most effectively. Her individual story was already written by centuries of institutional refinement in the art of systematic human destruction. The next time you encounter sanitized versions of medieval history that focus on chivalry and romance, while ignoring the systematic brutality that made such fantasies possible, remember the women whose names were erased, whose bodies were mutilated, whose families were obliterated, and whose very existence was denied. Their suffering built the foundations of the world we inherited, and their stories deserve to be told in all their horrific detail.